Oh my word, I'm a bit behind with all these things that I'm writing at the same time, and I need to make a YouTube video. Anyway, on I think I need to make 3 YouTube videos, including this one. Let me just quickly. Need to make one on South African politics. I need to make. No, I only need to make that one and this one. Okay, so I'm just going to catalog. I would call this theoretical speculation, but it's a bit harder than speculation. It's a bit more solid than speculation. I'm pretty sure I'm getting close to closing the gaps on all the things that I don't know and bringing the whole model into full view. So, and this might also give some light to certain, maybe this will be connected with the fundamental distinction between sattva, rajas, and tamas. Um, Although the answer to that question might just be much more simplistic and in a different section of the theory, where it just really has to do with the emotional tone that is the primary counter offer. That might be just the definition of sattva, rajas, or tamas, is that all emotional tones can essentially be categorized as sattva, rajas, or tamas, and whichever one falls into your singular primary counteroffer emotional tone, which is the thing that corresponds both to the unconscious and to the superego, which is in some sense the kind of the thing that holds the whole structure together, is kind of, so it might be that, or it might be more complicated, because the weirdest thing that I haven't yet fully explained as to something that I empirically came across, which I want to theoretically vet properly and have a theoretical explanation for it, or at least a proper confirmation of it theoretically, how it kind of fits together with other elements, so I can have some kind of corroboration, is that there is a kind of natural pecking order that has to do with, and that natural pecking order, that empirical observation that I made, I'm not that confident in it. Like, I almost feel like I might have made that construct because I just wanted to leave the door open that there are that there are structural formulaic differences between types, and that I was somewhat attributing it to sattva, rajas, or tamas. That perhaps because there seems to be some deep consistency between the 3 gunas, and that consistency needs to be cashed out into something, and it seemed to me that it was that there's this natural preference in terms of that, for example, sattva are essentially more subconscious focused, tamasic are more unconscious focused, and rajasic are more ego focused. But it is also, there are layers of complexity on top of that. There are layers of nuance on top of that, which are also unique to individual metagram circuits, or unique to also the variability within a particular metagram type. Because, and anyway, that's what I'm going to speak to now, the variability within circuits, and I think that what I'm about to say is workable. So now, in MBTI, I'm regarded as an INTJ, and in socionics, I'm an ILI, which is not a that's not a complete correlation between socionics and MBTI, but that's just to say what sort of, maybe what kind of archetype I am. If you know, the kind of INTJ that is regarded as an ILI in socionics. Now, I have met people in my life who are INTJs, or at least from an MBTI perspective, I have been told that they type as INTJs. And I've been told that there is an archetype which is commonly sometimes even referred to as the stupid INTJ. And I mean, apart from that being insulting, I mean, I don't wish to mean it sort of in an insulting way, but essentially, the so called stupid INTJ, I think I have an explanation for this. And this explanation is a little bit at odds with perhaps some of the things that I've speculated before about a similar kind of topic, which is, which I can't remember it right now, but it'll come to me in a bit, probably when I'm explaining further. So I think that my metagram type is the type that can manifest as the stupid INTJ, but it can also manifest as someone who is even perhaps perfectly balanced between the two variability configurations. Okay, so and this oh sorry, so this might be an alternative explanation of bipolar. Yeah, so what I'm about to get into kind of shatters the mold of some of the speculative structures that I tried to describe with the circuitry before around bipolar. They might not be mutually exclusive. They might be an interplay of both of these of both of these factors. So my earlier speculation, and which is just still a useful, I think, working model, and I think it might be true, is that if the emergent response is developed in such a way to create an ulterior subconscious model, an ulterior subconscious framework, then it ends up, and there might be a more delineated, a more clear, definitive way of describing this, and I think I might have done that work earlier, which I'm not going to do the same job of now, is in terms of how the virtual primary counter offer develops and subverts the existing sort of subconscious network and in integration between the sides of the mind, and essentially creates an ulterior superego. Even like having a virtual superego sort of breaks the sacred contract that was the development of the ego from the superego, and so you even have a way to sort of break out of your own superego um, in bipolar, essentially. And so because you've used an ingredient in the emergent response to develop an ulterior model of a subconscious, which you cultivated within the petri dish of the false ego complex, which kind of jailbreaks you from the whole grounding and the whole structure of the false ego complex, and you are really sort of entering into a complete into a complete, I mean that in the Greek sense, a kind of existential stasis, in which you freeze your false ego complex and are sort of playing in the dust, in the kind of cosmic sort of prima materia of the dimensions of psychological reality, and you're kind of and the only thing that you are pivoting around, the only thing that's holding you down is then the virtual primary counter offer, which has no other point of contact, or at least it has no superego point of contact. And so all it can really do is sort of expend the data which is held in the memory bank, which is in some sense unnetworked and untethered because the subconscious framework that anchored it has been repudiated or substituted. Okay, so anyway, so that's probably something. Okay, so that's I think that's a decent workable explanation to what bipolar type 1 is happening. here's an alternative view using what I'm going to call an extended view and explanation of corners. Okay, so the reason why my type is prone to bipolar to some degree is because it's stimulus emotional. It has two emotional tones in the stimulus, and it has two emotional tones in the emergent response. And both of these are corners. Wait, is that even true? Let me just double check that. It's worried and silly. Worried and silly are. Man, why do I have to make these posters so far away from me? Wait, no, which one? Yeah, worried and silly is the emergent response. No, wait, both of these are the same. So they can't be corners. Oh, no, wait, no, they're not the same. They have the same elemental signature, but they don't. So it's rushed and confused. I don't know where. I should have put these on the wall. Let me go up to. Where is rushed and. Where's confused? Okay, there. Rushed and confused. That's elemental symmetry. And worried and silly. That's also elemental symmetry. Okay, so what I was going to say about the corners, what I had in my mind is completely wrong, but let me see, I can probably rework it. So, okay, so if I'm right that I have come, okay, because basically what I'm saying is that, and I realize, I'm not just using this descriptively. I don't mean this as an actual indictment. So this is based on the presupposition that I'm archetypally speaking a clever INTJ. There are also other INTJs. I believe that metatype 8 is also a kind of INTJ, but the kind of archetypal INTJ that I am is a metagram type that shares the type with the stupid INTJ, that the stupid INTJ and the clever INTJ are both in the same boat, are both in the same type, but they manifest quite differently. And the reason why they manifest quite differently is because they have a different order of operation between their two emotional tones. That they use both emotional tones, but but essentially they use them in a different order. They use them in the opposite sequence. And so one is rushed and then confused, and the other is confused and then rushed. So the one feeds, the one is essentially sublimating the insight of the one into is being translated into the other. And so which one is the second one, I mean, is, so I mean, you can I guess I'd have to maybe invent some jargon around this, but so one is going to be sort of the initiating perceptive, is going to take on a perceptive kind of role, and the other one is going to take on a kind of agglomerating or aggregating insight. It's going to sort of, so the one is going to be a juxtaposition that has the stolen perceptiveness of the other one, and that's going to change its nature. So it's going to have a dual nature that's made up of a composite that has a particular order attached to it. But it might also be more complicated than that. It might also be that they're not strictly ordered, but there will naturally be a preference, or there'll naturally be a proclivity or a strength of the use of the one, and there will then largely ordinarily be a subordination of the one over the other. That just kind of naturally precipitates that they will get into some kind of pattern, some kind of working relationship that will be formally structured around the subordination of the one to the other. And the point here then is that the second one. Wait, is there a fixed correlation between rushed and worried, or confused or worried, or rushed and silly, or confused or silly? Because, oh no, no, oh, okay, yeah, so the emergent response is interesting because the emergent response needs to primarily correspond to the primary counteroffer, and the other one is a translation. So I think that the emergent response will have a natural proclivity that will somewhat be built into the structure of the metagram itself. That it's going to be very hard to put the emergent response. So the emergent response is probably going to be more fixed because it's going to be orientated towards towards whichever one corresponds to the primary counteroffer, which is why if you change the preference of the emergent response, you can create a virtual primary counteroffer and then create a major manic episode or psychosis, or essentially you can completely unroot the subconscious emotional tone order, or subordinated network, or whatever, or the kind of the anchor point. So, sorry, this is probably, this is a bit embarrassing reasoning this while I'm looking at it. Anyway, so yeah, so there is and I can feel this within myself if I just kind of, if I think about the structure of my own personality, and how I'm able to sort of access and what was I just about to say? Access and within my conceptualization of how this model is made up, how I'm able to see it inside myself, I can certainly see that if I channel the emergent response tone is a viable emergent response on a technical level, but it is a disintegrating. It puts me in a disintegrity if I were to take that as my preference. If I were to take that as my preference, it would be a devil may care kind of self repudiation, or at least a repudiation of likely my subconscious, or of the other tones. But I must say I haven't come to any clear introspective view over which of these internal emotional tones I have a preference for, or which one is subordinating the other ones. Maybe I should have meditated on that first. Or maybe it's very hard because, I mean, listen to what these stimulus emotional tones are: rushed and confused. It doesn't help because you see it's always rushed is at the detriment of placidity, and confused is at the detriment of trust. And it's at the both of those tones are I think are negatory tones. Actually, I should check that. Let me just double check that. I should really take this off the wall. Yeah, that's negatory, and it's symmetrical, so rush should be the same. Yeah, they're both negatory. Which means that rushed is the fifth dimension of psychological reality. Prudence acting in the absence of placidity, and confused is the first dimension of psychological reality, instinct acting or operating or in the absence of trust. So it's instinct without trust, and it's prudence without placidity. That's my definition. And elementally speaking, it is that is essentially fire without water, or it is fire in the absence of water. Elementally speaking. And then the primary counter offer that compensates for this is tranquility is a positive emotional tone, which is faith with it's faith offering faith operating with. So I'm just trying to think of some technical language. I could just read it with this. What is this? Annoyed. Yeah. Experiencing faith operating with a stronger appreciation of tranquility. And then I've got this written out in the long form. So it's experiencing a grasp of why things should be a particular way, distinguished by a stronger appreciation of how those things are. So that's my technical definition of being annoyed. In cognitive functions, which is tranquility is the 17th dimension and faith is the 13th dimension of psychological reality. Okay, so that is my primary counter offer to my stimulus. And then my emergent response is to be worried. And then also elementally sympathetic to that is that I can be silly as well. But the primary thing is being worried, because being worried is the consort to being annoyed. So the emergent response is in my view, or this is a technical truth, is that the ego always has the primary counter offer on retrograde. It is like the yin yang, the one is consuming the other one infernally, as a kind of persistent, recurring dramatization. And so sort of the worry, to be worried is the shadow to be annoyed, and being annoyed is the shadow of being worried. And this is how the ego sets up its symmetry and its congruence with the other sides of the mind, essentially, or at least its congruence with the unconscious. And so there is a very strict relationship between the unconscious and the ego, which is also, this was essentially this was the kernel insight that developed into the four sides of the mind theory, which was something that I was a part of developing, although I never get credit for these things because I do them in the shadows with people. But anyway, it'd be very interesting if someone ever publicly denounced my claims of I'm certainly not accusing anyone of plagiarism, although technically I guess it might count as that, because I think just not getting credit when credit is due technically counts as plagiarism. But I'm certainly not leveraging that accusation, as this was all my design and at my behest, not an unwilling participant in my own conspiracy against my own lack of credibility. Anyway, I guess as incredulous as all that sounds, but okay, so what is happening in these things? So the problem is that there are all these different types of stimuluses. My stimulus is weird because it has an elemental sympathy, but I'm guessing that then in my type, you don't need the other one. You only need one of them. You don't have to use both of them. So it's kind of it's not it's either or both. It it's either it's all possible. It can be in combination or it can be in singular. And it might actually be that if you are this particular metagram type might be especially special because the stimulus itself is not bound. It's not actually, in terms of how the subconscious is developed, it is not constructed out of the emotional tones at the base. It is constructed out of the elemental. It's constructed out of the elemental signature. That might be the difference between sattva, rajas, and tamas, is that maybe every single type has an elemental signature which they are attached to, which is the foundation of their false ego complex in terms of its positive development into the positive sides of the mind from the super-ego. And that is the starting point. And the starting point essentially is the side of the mind that is fundamentally not an emotional tone. It's fundamentally an elemental signature. And then the other emotional tones that are that fall in as sequitur. So it's like my primary counter offer is an emotional tone. My emergent response is an emotional tone of two elemental signatures, but my stimulus is fundamentally not an emotional tone. It's an elemental signature which corresponds to two emotional tones. And the reason why then sattva, I associate sattva with being subconscious, predicated in the subconscious, is because there is that fundamental nebulousness which is the hook, which is the catch that holds you to the entire pattern. That, and man, I've thought about this construct before. I'm probably not going to explain it that well now, but maybe I had I hope I've recorded this in an earlier recording, where there does have to be some collusion on some level within one of the positive sides of the mind, that it is committing to a false ego complex, that it has to know that it's in on the self-deception. It has to sort of be part of playing the game, which then sort of becomes this intractable self recurring dramatization that you just kind of are procedurally, mechanically sort of conditioned to constantly cater to machining or so I mean, it's this weird paradox that so you're engaged in a kind of self-production of the false ego complex, but what is the self that is performing that self-production in an ongoing sort of way? And it might be that the difference between the gunas is that, look, maybe I'm being much too speculative. Maybe all the types are subconsciously focused. And the reason why I believe that some people are more unconscious than other people or more ego driven than other people is simply because that those are developmental obstacles or maturity locks or something like that. And it might have more to do with circuit structure than it does with guna. It might have to do with that there are certain developmental obstacles which certain circuit types are more prone to falling into or being, and so in some sense the actual difference between the different types is not guna. It's just sort of, are you a single circuit or what kind of double circuit are you? Are you a double circuit with a corner or are you a double? But I mean, although people will generally look somewhat similar to one another because the primary counteroffer and the emergent response is always in some kind, there's always a corner. There's at least one corner in each personality type of the false ego complex, but that corner is not within an emergent response or within a stimulus. It's between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response. That is a granted. That is a given. That there is a corner that is established between the unconscious and the ego, between the emergent response and the primary counteroffer. Although it might I don't know. So maybe there's variation between when that develops within a particular development of a type. That it might be that sattva developed that last. They developed the other machinery first. And so their subconscious is much more coherent and transparent. Sattva in Hinduism is often described as being the most truthful, the most transparent, the most light, the golden chains of karma. Whereas if you develop the ego first, and then you develop the unconscious primary counteroffer, and then you develop the subconscious last, it has the least, and the subconscious, I do think, is the end game of self-actualization and development after you have actually dealt with the shadow and the integration of the superego, is in the reformulation of the subconscious, essentially. And the more delineated and delicate and sophisticated and structured your subconscious is, probably in some sense, I do think that it is kind of the rudder that you eventually catch up to in order to kind of even the keel and refurbish the boats. Right? I don't know what the actual term is in I don't even know what to call the field. Naval Brigsman. No. What is a brigadier? Is a pirate or something, or a mercenary. Not someone that fixes boats. Anyway. That somewhat to mix this topic on a similar theme, sort of the famous philosophical question, sort of, if you've replaced every part of a boat, is it still the same boat? But if you have delicately constructed the subconscious, then you know how it all fits together. You know where all the seams come together, so that it's easier to reconstruct it piece by piece, and somewhat you know the entity that you're working with, even though you're displacing it or you are revamping it. So having a more delineated view of how your subconscious is structured gives you, in some sense, a target, a goal, an objective in terms of the journey of self-development, and self-actualization. It gives you a kind of target, the treasure at the end of the rainbow, or at least a slight inkling of the solution of the entire structure, or at least some familiarity with perhaps the fundamental incoherence that as to why it needs to be restructured. And so sattva are more transparently available to the kind of humility or meekness or sort of awareness of their own need for integration and psychological um, stuff. Uh, this is a bit of a disparate thing to bring up, but I've been watching Star Trek Discovery, and I just watched their 4th episode of the season. It's interesting. It's almost as if they heard some of the complaints that I made about Star Trek Discovery. I'm not crazy enough to necessarily believe that they're listening to me and they're responding to me, but I had just complained that none of the episodes are character-based and have character-based development in them. And sort of almost to contradict me, they seemingly constructed an episode that ostensibly just tries to fit that bill. And I want to criticize them further, but in some sense, it was a good approximation of what I was complaining about to some degree, in terms of trying to cover that base, or to try to I'm just using this as a figurative thing, as if they were listening to my critique of them. But the reason why this 4th episode fails on being this character driven, I mean, it was, everything was much more personal to the characters, and to the main characters. I mean, the doctors have always had actually very powerful character driven arcs of the story, but they're not really. I mean, Stammens, I guess, is the main character. I hope I've got the right name right. The scientist guy who navigated the ship with being plugged into it. But I don't really consider them to be the main protagonists of the plot. The main protagonists of the plot are the captains, and maybe the second in command. And so look, I mean, obviously, these ensemble casts, they have many main characters, and it's good to have stories around many of the characters, and to focus in on escapades around, or focusing on those characters. But and so I mean, then, to say that the whole show has no character driven elements to it is incorrect. The problem is that all the main characters um, have, too many of the characters are hollow. And in some sense, on some level, you could say it's almost not their fault, because it's almost what the show is trying to do is the show is trying to create a kind of compelling tool for psychological self-knowledge of contemporary people, but at least what is fashionably conceived to be the new person, the new human being, the new template of consciousness within our culture, which is sort of trying to ideologically carry the banner of identity politics and a worldview that has identity politics sort of premised into it. And, you know, the Star Trek Discovery is fundamentally ideologically trapped by this intractable problem that it has to solve, that it has to dignify ideology which is fundamentally disingenuous. It has, and I mean, when I say disingenuous, I mean it's psychologically disingenuous. It makes the people who have that worldview, it makes them feeble imposters, and there's no way of getting around that. They can't graduate out of that self-cast ineptitude. And their primary way of engaging in the world is what I would call a fascistic cultural interface, where you are not in you have no authentic participation in any interaction. The characters themselves and how they talk to one another and how they communicate and how they engage with one another, they have no self-esteem. They have a substitute for self-esteem, which is disgusting and fascistic. It is a projection of how they should be treated by their surroundings, how they should be validated. They have a picture, an ideological picture, which they are projecting against their environment as a kind of preemptive accusation, as a preemptive charge to be levied if they don't get the validation that they argue in their ideological projection that they deserve, that they anticipate. So they have an expectation of how they should be treated by other people. And because essentially their self-esteem is premised on how they are received, they have no embodied self-esteem. They only have this ideological picture which they project out in front of them, and they watch how other people touch it. They watch how other people interact with it. And then they speak in such a disembodied way to one another, talking about this contemplative projection. So everything becomes about this ideological picture, which everyone is either in agreement with, they're plugged in with, or they're not plugged in with. But the problem is that if you try to get your self-esteem from your surroundings, from an external locus of control for how you are treated, and you don't already embody it, you don't already give it to yourself in some sense, and then, yes, it's fine when other people agree with the self-esteem that you already have. But when you essentially are saying, are you making me an imposter? If you are constantly charging the people around you with making you feel like an imposter because they don't already give you what you expect or what you anticipate, you are imposing a context by a kind of unilateral anticipation, but that unilateral anticipation is the source of your self-esteem. You know, you're completely outwardly focused because you don't have any principles. Essentially, you're not grounded in your own principles. You're grounded in looking for a test that will prove to you that your beliefs are correct externally. So you don't already believe in your own grounding. So you are looking for you're anticipating a validation to come from the outside. And that is done with this ideological projection of this picture of what you expect. And you're constantly testing and looking if other people are passing the test that you have ideologically rigged your worldview into. So you have people who are stuck in their own toxic paradox of trying to prove that they're not imposters to themselves, using other people as what is it called? As props, using other people as props and using other people's validation and communication and words as props for their own self-esteem. And so they can never help self-esteem because they're trying to extract it from an external self-worth. from an external source of self-worth. They are obsessed with how their identity is received. They are obsessed with how it's all identity, um, ideation and idolatry and politics around identity. And trying to have this theme within Star Trek is so fundamentally broken, because you can see, even as they try to work through some of these issues, they do it in the most reprehensible and morally repugnant sort of way possible. So you have a group of aliens who have all grown up in an isolated fashion, and so they're not used to dealing with people that don't look like them. They're not used to dealing with people that are of other species. And they all have suspicions against one another because they haven't done the job of actually communicating with each other and getting to know each other on an individual basis. And so it turns out that the one has a suspicion against the other because the same category of species did bad things to his people. So he has this accusation, even though that the personal history of the person of this other species comes from a lineage, is saved in terms of the plot of this particular episode because his father was actually one of the good guys. So, and he actually suffered for his moral stance. But if that guy was not vicariously redeemed by the inheritance of his father's good deeds, and his father suffering in prison and dying in prison, then where the hell would that individual be? Well, imagine if his father was a bastard instead. Then what? Would he then be fucking irredeemable? Would it be impossible for him to want to join Star Trek on his individual merit and so no, he's saved by the essence of his fucking inheritance. He's not treated as an individual, he's treated as a token of his father's symbolic act for the group. I mean, it's utterly dehumanizing, which is a slightly strange thing to say, talking about people that are playing alien species. But it's normalizing fascistic identity politics values. It's fucking disgusting. The whole thing is, I mean, it's a fucking travesty. It's a complete betrayal of Star Trek fundamentally. But that's where we are right now. These people, in trying to argue around the normalization of the fascism that we sit with, and I mean, this is also, I'm going to get into this quite deeply when I make a recording about South African politics, but I was going to go through 3 different videos in South African politics. I was going to go over what the DA said afterwards, after they took it as a victory for the Constitution that the amendment to the Constitution failed. And I was going to play the video about an advocate who was talking about the debate around expropriation without compensation. And he said that this is good because it's a return, it's perhaps the beginning of a return to constitutionalism and back to the rule of law and away from these blunt measures. But in his own analysis of how proper policy could be used or refined to better reflect what's in the Constitution, he, in a very sloppy way, relied on racialist, dogmatic categorization. And I would expect someone in the legal fraternity to be much more precise with their language and to fucking be consistent with the Constitution. But instead, he mirrored the same toxic racialist nonsense and the same sloppiness that he was, in effect, arguing against. So even when people argue for a return to constitutionalism, they still have inherited the normalization of this fascistic and immoral racialist mentality. I mean, he was essentially using white people as a proxy for anyone who has inherited privilege, that can just be reducible to your group dynamic. And he left it very ambiguous. I will say that he left it ambiguous, and I think he left it ambiguous on purpose, so that he could prove his virtue signaling that he's kind of I don't know, to make his views more palatable. But I mean, I believe that on the basis of that interview alone, he should be disbarred from the legal fraternity, because it was utterly disgusting. That overt betrayal of constitutionalism. I mean, this whole interview, which was a long interview, I think it was at least 15 minutes, maybe it was 12 or 19 minutes, but it was a fairly long interview with his advocate. And the whole setup and premise of this journalistic interview was so, it was anti-constitutional propaganda. It was a patent betrayal of non-racialism. I mean, is that even when someone is essentially arguing to go back to the rule of law and back to constitutionalism, can't even help himself getting into this racialist, disgusting dogma and anti-constitutional filth. I mean, it was utterly disgusting watching how he sloppily laid out this ambiguous moral argument, very clearly set to, I mean, I guess, maybe you can make the claim that he's trying to create a bit of a booby trap for the fascists and tend them towards some kind of rehabilitated moral thinking and reasonable thinking about issues. But I actually take the opposite view, that this shows that the fascists, the black racialists, have won. They have created a new middle ground. They've created a new normalization in politics, and in some sense it's very deeply connected with this idea of substituting self-esteem with identity consciousness, with racial consciousness and racialist categorization of people, and treating people as a caste, as a group, to have a kind of blanket moral accusation levied against them. And it's very sad, because it's very disempowering on a fundamental level, on a psychological level. You can only be a broken person when you use this kind of ideological crutch. You will only ever be something of an imposter trying to fulfill some kind of token representation of your idealistic projection of how other people should be validating you. There's no justice. There's no true sense of justice and principles which are held at your core. It's just a reliabilism, a dependency on external I mean, there is a nuance here, which, I mean, because I realize that I write letters to people that I've been thinking about, and I've been trying to work out how to, because I get into quite intimate detail about my own psychological state, and describe my own problems. And I mean, a lot of my problems are essentially around communication, because essentially I feel quite stifled that I can't communicate about my life for various complicated reasons. Um, and some of that is just basically unfortunate. Um, that there's sort of a set of unfortunate a confluence of unfortunate circumstances that make it difficult to for me to feel integrated, because you do need to think out loud through the process of communication. And if you can't communicate about topics, you can't settle your own thinking on the issue. You can't explore the issue fully. And so, kind of strict privacy, or the compulsion towards strict privacy, means that you can't um, you can't think through issues as easily as you could if you could share things. I mean, the view that you can only share things with other people who already agree with you or understand with you, um, so that you can properly ventilate and explore all the myriad permutations of such potential threads of thinking. Or I mean, I do suffer myself from an element of that. And in some sense, the reason why I suffer from that is because many people reject that kind of communication because, in their estimation, it's too likely to be incorrect or wrong, essentially. It's too likely to be false. And so they don't have the patience or the interest for it, or they don't want to invest the consideration of the strange complexity that it might contain. And and people also have practical problems, so I mean, it's sort of, if I want to communicate about something, it's up to me really to try to locate someone who's capable of enduring it, and that I feel comfortable making endure that, and hopefully I have some positive purpose attached to that uh, desire, or so I'm just trying to think of a word that means sort of to that plan, or that and I think that most people essentially can always find what it is that they're looking for. The problem that I particularly have is that I am myself conflicted in a kind of indecision, because I weigh the costs or the consequences of these sorts of actions, and this is also informed from my experience of also attempting to have this kind of communication with people before, and uh, I've had so many negative experiences that it's just and I am also on a slight indecision myself that maybe the whole thing is a kind of confabulation. Maybe all of my memories and all of my stories and all of my beliefs and all of the detailed things that I think I remember, maybe it's all just some kind of disassociated, identity disordered kind of mirage of some kind. I mean, I honestly don't believe that, but I think that it's a possibility that's technically um, that I would perhaps have to reconcile myself to if I can ever find a way to directly corroborate uh, or corroborate the with the refutation of what I believe are real memories. So I mean, so, I mean, this is the thing. I take it as a technical possibility that I need to sort of sort out at some point. Anyway, it's and you see, this is a really toxic rabbit hole. And involving other people in it is often a diversion from actual practical positive purposes and things that can be done. But and then this sort of leads me to a kind of self-pitying loneliness. But I mean, again, I mean, this is not something that I did not preemptively reconcile myself to. I mean, there was kind of always going to be an intrinsic alienation in the extreme and radical projects and course that my life has been devoted into pursuing. You know, and really the only real source of my discomfort is sort of two things which are the same thing. The one which is the indecision around or the uncertainty around the merit or the value that my work is you know, sort of is going to be useful to anybody else. And perhaps the other effort that I have and the other projects that I believe that I've been a part of sort of directly paralleled with having gone this route so well, this is the thing, is that I do really consider myself to have two separate lives, in the sense that one is a second set of experiences which don't really fall into my day-to-day, they're not congruent with my day-to-day living and experiences. And so this inconsistency the only person that I can believe to hold up the coherence of the seeming or appeared inconsistency is myself. So, you know, sort of I have to, by a force of will in some sense, and essentially that requires, on some level, a hopefulness that my ongoing effort will pay off. It will be valuable to other people at some point. But also the more I learn about psychology itself, I mean, even if I believe that my research and my work does intrinsically hold value, according to my own estimations and evaluation of it, which it does, just essentially the sheer sense of alienation leaves me to consider that this yeah, I've been thinking about other issues as well, and maybe this is the same issue paralleled in a completely different sort of theme. That, I find myself that often in situations I'm caught in a kind of catch-22 where I don't like the fact that I'm so patient with other people who I think are like, I would prefer to have no patience for other people that have little patience. For people that have little patience, I wish I had no patience for them. But instead, I grant them, in fact, I grant them almost the devotion of my life towards reaching out and connecting and creating a kind of bridge. But it does leave me in a kind of in a conundrum, in a kind of catch-22, because the patience that I am sacrificing on the altar of this good intention to connect and reach out is, in some sense, a investing into a possibility. It's buying a lottery ticket, and there is a I mean, I can certainly put people to terms. Sometimes that's not possible if the connection is so tenuous that or it's a combination of essentially how invested they are into their substitute for integrity, or how brittle their interpretive matrix is, in terms of being openly made susceptible to I've seen this. I'll explain it out because, but I've seen this term. I'm not sure if hopefully I'm using it correctly, but sort of because I can explain exactly how to do this practically. Is that you really have to be able to hold your own beliefs in a bundle, in a prime set of beliefs, and you say these are my primary These are my primary ways of, of navigating. And then you really have to sort of have an open ulterior model for different beliefs, for contrasting beliefs. And you have to try to construct a completely ulterior system. And then you have to construct a third system of a potential integration. So, and essentially the secret here is that the second set of beliefs should be other people's beliefs, should be other people's style and way of operating in the world. Should create a sponge in your mind that is like somebody else. And then you have that model so that you can understand the nature of their character and the content of their understanding and how it mechanically, stylistically operates. And then you're not just dealing with these two things, with your prime beliefs and their understanding. You're dealing with then a third test-benched understanding. And sometimes you have to open yourself to the possibility of creating that alternative. And this is why I hate identity politics, because I fully understand it. I mean, like, I understand the kind of the emotional knots that you can knot yourself into as you torment yourself and then scapegoat the intrinsic kind of incoherence onto an external source of blame, so that you can kind of always excuse yourself and continue the same strategy of essentially depending on an external locus of control instead of principles that ground yourself and that you hold yourself responsible for choosing those principles and also for reasoning from those principles. And you can sort of refine your reasoning from principles based on added understandings of other things, like just general beliefs and general things. But if you don't essentially identify with your own principles and you don't reason from first principles, which can be supported by general knowledge and general understanding of other factors, but essentially that your moral integrity is sourced in your choice of principles. And in some sense, when you recognize that you do have such a choice, it is a bit tricky to begin it in your mind. It is a bit, because you have to bootstrap it, because in some sense you have to blame yourself for even your lack of choosing your principles in the past. Even if you never consciously chose your principles in the past, you have to blame yourself for the nescence of failing to choose your principles in the past. You have to take on that blame, because if you don't take on that blame, there is no dignity to which you might possibly attain to, because your agency is always going to be an orphan or an inheritor of the world. Blaming its lack of fortune or exalting a kind of fatalistic luck in terms of what it's been handed. I don't believe in gratitude for one's understanding, although that's perhaps a slightly complicated issue, because you can have a kind of confidence and a gratitude in the confidence in your understanding, I guess, but as not, you can't have gratitude for it as a precipitate from the world. You have to own it yourself. And in some sense, the only way that you can get ownership from it is if you can have real justified responsibility for it. And that essentially has to come from blame. If you don't blame yourself for the lack of the conscious choice of it, then the conscious choice of it you never become accountable, you never own it. It never belongs to you, unless it always belonged to you. So I believe that it's a natural requisite in order, you have to bootstrap it. Otherwise, you don't bootstrap it, you don't have intrinsic dignity. Or I don't see how you can have a self-coherent view of intrinsic dignity, except that you inherit it from your own free choice to consider and understand the fundamental essence that you graduated from as the first developmental step of having a spiritual understanding, or because the spirit, that's what the spirit is, just the character of your understanding. Where is your understanding headed towards? Where is it going? What is it pointing at? What is it suggesting? And that can only be understood by an understanding. It can only be discerned by another understanding. It cannot be expressed as a belief, it can have corresponding beliefs pursuant to it and pursuant from it that help navigate that understanding. But that is in some sense that is the flesh, that is the vessel, that is the earthen container of the spirit, of the understanding. The understanding is therefore communicatable, it's expressible, but it's also ephemeral. Anyway, these kinds of paradoxes. But and essentially what makes it mysterious is that you have to understand that there's a simultaneous mystery here. And the simultaneous mystery is that the understanding is, in its truest sense, positive and affirmative, and affirms values and principles. But in terms of the medium in which the flesh operates, in terms of the flesh of communication, the flesh of the potentiality of thinking and speculation and skepticism and rationalization, essentially the scope of interpretation or hypothetical contemplative considerations, that flesh can only be true in the sense that you can know how it falls short of truth. You can know how it essentially it might sort of try to approximate the affirmative principle and understanding which only the agent can subjectively commit to and choose, and do so freely. You can only freely bootstrap the blame for your nescience, for choosing, or the lack of choosing, of your principles. But you have to choose to consider that that was always a choice. That was always the choice all along, that you were making all along, even if you weren't conscious that you were making it. You are nescient. You are blameworthy for not having made that choice. And if you don't I believe that if you don't come to that belief, you don't have a foundation upon which to have any intrinsic dignity of your epistemic agency. You therefore don't have free will. You have a sentience that is capable of producing free will, but you haven't graduated into it. You are still a child of the world, and you hear the world, and the world hears you, and you hear the arguments of the world, and you hear the rationalization of the world, and you add to the chorus of the chaos and the insolubility and the intractability, because you haven't yet realized that that stuff is insoluble. Because only the understanding is a I could say a lot of different things, but is a self-coherent source of merit or virtue or veracity, truthiness. That's where truth comes from. The act of self-determinism. When I say active, I mean that in the immediate infinitive sense of like a verb. This is why tense is so strange in the scriptures, and why the modern translations of the Bible are so terrible in their treatment of the actual doctrine. But because if I said it in other ways, I would have to change the grammar and it would sound obscure, because I would have to say the activation on the activation on the choice to act from your chosen principles. I mean, this is why you see this forever in Christianity with the seed of the fruit-bearing tree inside the fruit. The fruit with the seed of the fruit-bearing tree in itself. That is the metaphor, the figurative metaphor of the spirit of the understanding, is the fruit that has the seed of the tree that makes the fruit inside of itself. That is epistemic agency. Anyway, so perhaps I am being slightly too hyperbolic. In that there are some people that can certainly see me. But they have always given me some slight cautious food for thought. I'm afraid to say what to title the role, but I'll just quote a caring voice that would often tell me, uh, that the sea is vast and powerful, but all it does is sink into the sand. And the people who try to build structures in the sand the waves come. The waves come to reclaim what one has essentially built out of the desolate matter. But yeah, I mean, in some sense, I think it's more of a warning as to keeping my view to accomplishments and actual sort of sustainable victory of some kind. I mean, that's in the end, that's the final. That's the final test that I've probably hinged my entire soul into, or leveraged my entire soul into. But it's true in other ways as well, I guess. But at least the course that I have taken is something of the variety of victory or death. When I say death, I mean spiritual death. A very strange kind of project, but one that I think is capable of defeating the sea, which has essentially been my life's work, figuratively speaking. And although contemplatively it's in view, pragmatically it requires a kind of work that I might not be entirely suited to, but well, I do have some influence. I should say some influences. But much in the way of sort of the butterfly effect. If my memories are true, a lot more than that, perhaps even as well. Yeah, it is quite incredible. I mean, if my memories are true, then, you know, I can't even imagine a historical character that has had more influence over a particular time than myself. Except it's hard to know what was going on in the background in terms of Carl Jung and Freud and World War II, which, if anyone is wondering what the hell I might be referring to, is although this is not directly true in every sense, it's true in some. There are other true senses of, but partly one of the mythological premises of Full Metal Alchemist, apart from being autobiographical of my life to some degree, a large theme of Full Metal Alchemist is in fact Carl Jung and Freud, essentially doing the work of trying to discover the Philosopher's Stone and obtain one, and at the same time the world creates a sympathetic, that the sea of the world creates a defense mechanism when it feels that it's having its secrets unraveled, and that the structure of the systems of probably too dangerous to generalize about the world too badly, because there are myriad styles of misunderstanding and miscomprehension and loving the darkness. That shuns the light of a justified understanding of what I'd spoken earlier about in terms of the epistemic agent. And also, I mean, the epistemic agent can also be well taught and well known just by osmosis, just by admiration and modeling. I mean, it can somewhat be replicated or duplicated by just knowing someone and admiring them for that quality, and in this way, secretly, perhaps without very clear technical lines of philosophy, although I do think that for it to conserve itself, it does need some level of doctrinal memory in order to keep itself within the band of the dangers of self-repudiation or self-deception or essentially some kind of indecision that leads to the free choice being obscured, of operating from one's first principles. In my sense, I think, my particular problem is just that I guess I perhaps harbor some resentment against my own free choice because I feel trapped to some degree by the arduous journey that in my weaker moments I imagine has no use to other people. You know, sort of, if you're going to sacrifice so much ostensibly to help other people and then you lose hope that that help will ever be delivered, then and it's weird because I don't know if I can even necessarily describe that as a lack of faith in myself, although actually that is what it is proximately, I think. But that I am indulging in having a lack of faith of other people. Which is interesting because that could correspond with being confused and essentially distrusting other people and looking at what will be primarily in the absence of what things should be like. I guess the whole point of this technical modeling of psychology was that it was to be an academically palpable, irrefutable model that could give enough detail about psychological behavior that it could be used to create something of a philosopher's stone within secularity, within secular culture, within the academy, because in some sense you can't just claim justice, you also have to claim, although justice is probably the biggest component of it, you could have a corrupted intellectual establishment as long as you didn't have a corrupted justice system that was capable of judging the intellectual establishment as being properly out of its league when it wades into trying to provide expert testimony into the justice system and into the legal tradition. You know, you don't want witch doctors in the form of psychological experts with their theories walking into court and providing diagnoses against people so as to essentially displace the proper assessment of claims and controversies. could be easily argued that such attempts at providing diagnoses that circumvent the independent adjudication of issues by a judge is itself a kind of witchcraft, because what is a diagnosis? Is it not a spell that needs to be independently reasoned and understood, at least in the judicial paradigm? But anyway, my general contention is that the only way to have a solid foundation in the academy is that psychology needs to be regarded as the queen of the sciences, that the ontology of psychology is the epistemology in philosophy. And without a deep theory of mind, and which is symbolically conjoined in a phenomenological, philosophical framework and grounding from which all other technical specializations or other academic pursuits could be referenced within a cohesive understanding. That would also prevent much of the intellectual charlatanism and sort of quackery that happens when people can leverage skeptical rationalizations and displace correctness and truth claims with essentially self-consistency. You know, when self-consistency is what I would consider rationality to essentially be. Self-consistency does not mean something is correct. Doesn't even mean that it's possible, in fact. But it could be seen as maybe a helpful... But I mean, there are lots of things which are actually not self-consistent, which can also have reasons, good reasonableness, as to believe that it is true, but it just wouldn't be a candidate for an actual understanding or a worldview. But there are mechanisms which, seen as independent models of things, that can be irrational and perfectly reasonable and coherent. The thing that would make holistic sense of these things would be the context of a full understanding. And full understandings should themselves be rational or self-consistent, but they need more than that. They need more than self-consistency. But we live in a world in which rationality is used as the substitute for proper coherence and reasonableness. And so we end up with this pseudo-blind religion of a kind of unimatrix of logic or rationality, where everything that is logical is somehow a universal piece of the puzzle of the ultimate truth. And so, you know, it's this kind of, I think they call it neo-pragmatic academic I think they call it neo-academic pragmatism. That somehow people are just collecting pieces of the puzzle, and that eventually, according to the Newtonian Ponzi scheme, that after the last model has been modeled out, then suddenly the holistic unity will emerge from the last piece of the last brick in the wall being shuffled in. That then somehow it'll all vindicate everything, and everything will have a place within this kind of logical unimatrix. It's a completely disembodied, abstracted, blind faith Ponzi scheme that people inherited essentially from the Newtonian methodology of modeling things first and explaining things later, and essentially displacing true understanding with just mathematical modeling. Which is why I have such problems as well, just trying to conceptualize how I would ever prove my models. Because essentially all I could do is just look at the geometry of mathematical identities and congruences, and that's sort of the only vindication you can ever have. That's the most that science can ever do, because it never verifies. It can only falsify. It's the anathema to an understanding, and people who have squared this circle are miscreants. They are charlatans. They are feeble-minded pretenders. And the kind of toxic authority that they seek to wield is the ongoing depravity that this world is beholden by. And the sad thing is that whenever they have a victory, then they inspire others in their rotten and detestable ways of false authority and false doctrines, and which is in some sense always a model of some kind of false prophet. Although it is often premised in obscuring that hidden influence. Okay, let me stop this rambling. Okay, I have a second lot of things to raise, which annoy me because, these things, how they compound in their complexity of variability in terms of what I'm trying to outline and describe is certainly going in the wrong direction. But anyway, necessarily need to sort of compile these plausible permutations, permeations of. So another sketchy element in my model was that I was really at odds definitively whether each guna only had recourse to 8 cognitive functions, And I knew that there was something that corresponded. Sorry, when I said 8 cognitive functions, I meant to say, sometimes I meant to say 4 cognitive functions and 8 emotional tones. If each guna was completely constricted within 4 cognitive functions and 8 emotional tones, although it's never true that emotional tones are only made up of 4 cognitive functions, they are made, in some sense, primarily around 4 cognitive functions, but they have covalent sort of bonds with um, those four primary cognitive functions have uh, this is annoying because let me just think for a second. Is it I see, it depends how you want to measure it, but essentially if you want to measure it from the relative perspective of other gunas and from their base of 4, but essentially those 4 cognitive functions have a fixed correlated relationship with 4 other cognitive functions from other gunas. Anyway, and so like if you want to give each component of a covalent bonded pair equal nominal value, then each pairing is shared by 2 gunas. And I still don't theoretically know which side of the fence to fall on in terms of how to then conceptualize which fall into which category, if there if there's a sharp demarcation between which cognitive functions properly belong to which guna, um, which is also what's always given me this realm of possibility as to how exactly to have a clear definition of what each guna is, and if it's not perhaps found in other structural features like um, which side of the mind was developed rather than the actual cognitive function, because the cognitive functions involved in the emotional tones or particular emotional tones like this, which the stimulus primary counteroffer or emergent response, because either one of those categories is going to be sort of the prime unit or the central figure that then defines whether they what guna they are. And the reason why that variance has become obvious is because um, it has become clear to me in looking at the model of metagram that I developed, that my original tables of them, I had to record a kind of open, plausible variation, but still record the complexity that I was observing, and the complexity that I was observing um, I left ambiguous because I didn't understand exactly the nature of the things themselves. I didn't know all the knowledge around field circuits. So because I didn't have a clear view of what field circuits entailed, um, whenever I wrote out the emotional tone circuitry of a particular guna, I wrote it in terms of elemental signatures. I didn't write it in terms of emotional tones, but then I also basically used the emotional tones um, as if the guna only had access to 8 emotional tones. But as I was writing those identities or using those emotional tone entities, I always coupled them with an emotional tones, with a cognitive function, with an elemental signature, um, because that's what they fundamentally were. And because I knew that in some sense, when the false ego uses these things, some of them are being used or utilized as an identity or an entity that is an emotional tone. But some of them, well, it was ambiguous as to which ones are elemental signatures and which ones are emotional tones. And in some sense, that is even self-evident within the table itself. And I have slightly misspoken um, when when going over these theoretical speculations. What I have misspoken is when I was just thinking about this somewhat sloppily, I guess, or somewhat uncarefully. Um, Originally, I was going to give a different kind of treatment of some of the speculation, uh, because I had even misremembered my own structural circuit type, or at least the finicky dynamics within it. And I was going to basically make a whole thesis around how some people have got a cornered stimulus, and I thought that maybe I was one of these types, and they have a cornered um, um, emergent response, but it's actually not possible to have a cornered emotional response. All double barreled, all emergent responses that have more than one emotional tone are never emergent responses when they have 2 emotional tones uh, uh, contained within them are never cornered. There's always a corner between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response, but there is no corner within the emergent response. It's always an elemental clone. It's always a cloned elemental signature, which also opens up a realm of variance, because essentially then I think that means that anyone who has a double-barreled emergent response essentially has a primary emergent response in some sense, or an initiating emergent response, and then they have a kind of a possible secondary emergent response which they can indulge in. So they have a kind of they have a kicker that they can play that card if they so wish, but the second card is sort of is uh, is almost like a flourish. It's not really a necessary. So the one is sort of sufficient, and the other one is sort of the primary initiating emergent response is somewhat, and probably having a second emergent response therefore is always perhaps leads to always a kind of interesting kind of karmic complexity in that particular kind of circuit type. Anyway, the stimulus can either be cornered or it can be of an elemental signature, and the vast majority of stimuluses are probably um, oh man, I don't have it in front of me. I could get it in front of me, but I believe that it's sort of actually let me just be numerically precise and get it out. So 1/8 of all metagram types have have a cloned elemental signature in their stimulus, and 3/8 have a cornered stimulus. And I would imagine that it's the cornered stimuluses, and then by the way, the remaining 4/8 just have a single entity stimulus. They just have a stimulus with a single identity. Um, so, but so the vast minority of types are the smallest minority of types have a cloned stimulus, of which I am one of those types. Um, but when I was when I was going to give the kind of rendition that I was going to give, I was saying, "Oh well, I'm a clever INTJ. I've just found the stupid INTJ." I was going to I was going to speculatively explain that in the case of thinking that I was a cornered type, and that essentially, therefore, there are two permutations of this meta type, of this metagram type. And the one permutation is that the one corner is eating the other corner, and then the other permutation is that the corner is going in the other direction. And that direction, in some sense, would be relative to the field circuit to some degree. And so someone would be going in the direction of the corner that goes in the flow of the field circuit, and the other one would be going in the opposite flow of that field circuit. And this would also explain why some people are very incongruent with other people, because they are doing the opposite thing within their stimulus emotional tone footprint. And so the one person would literally be consuming the other person's stimulus in terms of any kind of shared, so it would be very hard to kind of make a connection of a shared understanding with them, because they're constantly trampling on each other's initiating emotional tone, and then which gets internally transcribed or internally translated into an insight or a judgment made by the second emotional tone. And I do think that this is, so I mean, let me just somewhat rephrase this. I think that this is why bipolar type 2 individuals are, in my view, this is an observable, I think, ascription that one can. Anyway, so this conforms with what I've been saying, or at least the case that I'm trying to establish here, is that bipolar type 2 individuals are very set in their perceptions of things, because they need those perceptions to line up into the corner of a particular flow in that field circuit, and they need that field circuit to be completely consistent with the flow that they are running in that field circuit. And so they kind of they occupy, they are occupying, or they are what's the word that means they're almost conscripting a whole field circuit, because their stimulus needs it. Because it's not just that their stimulus needs to preserve that directionality of flow within that field circuit for them to operate their stimulus. And so they are, I still can't think of the right word, but they're commandeering an entire set of yeah. And so that might also have very pernicious effects in society at large, because when you have people that are running a whole field circuit, which is comprising of 6 emotional tones, only in one directional flow, you're going to, and I do also think that this might correspond also with gendered identity And I mean that in the sense of sort of the archetype or the tropes of femininity and masculinity, that it could be that these cornered flows, based on the imprint of personality. I've always thought that ideology itself and that cultural conventions and idioms within any kind of structure are essentially sourced in psychological um, mechanics, that essentially that for a convention or for something to evolve within a society, that it is fundamentally premised on a kind of psychological um, thing. That essentially the cult of ideology is somewhat premised in the cult of personality, essentially, that everything is first found within the personality or sourced within the personality. And so I'm making the broad claim, essentially, that how we developed our gender stereotypes and perhaps even have slightly evolved around these tropes within culture, or because I do think that to a large extent, let's say sexual politics, the sexual strategies and the dynamism between the sexes, through the cultural valence of gender, um, is going to be modeled by some kind of imprint of some kind of psychological source material. And anyway, what I'm saying is that to me it would make sense that these wherever these personality styles exist. I don't know. I'd have to go and do some clerical work to confirm whether these because I mean these corners, these 3/8 of all metagram types. There are 48 metagram types, so I'd have to go back and well, in some sense, this means that there are six signatures, which means that I think mathematically that means that at the most they would affect 3 field circuits. So that means that one field, I think, so I can be prone to clerical error, but I think that means that because a corner will always comprise of 2 emotional tones, and if there are 6 cornered types, in fact, it might not be necessarily the case that means that's reducible to three particular corners, and then you have one example running in one direction and one example running in the other direction. That might not be the case. It might be unevenly distributed, that essentially all field circuits have psychological types that have a particular corner, and some field circuits might be in some sense populated by a metagram personality style or a metagram personality type, where essentially there are only people that have corners that run in one direction in that field circuit. And so that field circuit is almost sort of going to be colonized within a society, within a culture, within a tradition, is always going to be eventually colonized by the personality styles which run their corner in one direction of that field circuit, and there is no contestation because there are no personality styles that run the counter direction on that same field circuit. So that's actually a very interesting question. I should go and do the clerical work to work out exactly what the actual case is there. But let me just continue the principle, because the principle of this is going to be more generally useful anyway, just in terms of developing the general framework of understanding. Is that, to me, it would make sense that one direction in a field circuit would be given the archetype or the stereotype of masculinity, and the other direction would be given the stereotype of femininity. Just in order that a society or a culture would be able to make visible the psychological idiom underpinning. Um, what did I just say? Did I just say that it would become visible? Make visible the psychological idiom. But obviously, culturally, it's only known as an idiom. It's not known as the proper contemplation of the source material, which is sort of somewhat intrinsically psychological, which can only be arrived at or located, through maybe it exists within some fields of knowledge, within sort of traditional healing and things like that, and shamanism or mysticism, or at least some kind of esotericism that at least cares enough about something like spiritual alchemy, perhaps, to collect knowledge of such a kind, or to systematize such knowledge of such a kind. Anyway. Okay, another thing, and this is going to sound horribly esoteric, and I haven't found a better way. There's probably a technical, more secular way of talking about this, but let me just be crude and say it as it occurred to me as a kind of lightning bolt of inspiration, that I think that metagram circuitry itself is a good enough correlate of the scriptural term of the blood. I think metagram is a description of the blood, and metagram circuitry, populated with its confluence of emotional tones, is the blood. That is what karma fundamentally is. It's made up of these grooves, of these beastly field circuits. And navigating that drama, navigating that inheritance. And I would even say that it might also be that particular bloodlines are themselves inheritors of an evolution of a kind of the implementation or the use, the idiomatic inheritance or the propensity to use emotional tones are perhaps or what bloodlines entail. So there's a kind of there is an evolving technology of and when I say evolving, I mean inherited predilection and proclivity and preference in terms of how emotional tones are utilized. And so, because and perhaps there are some personality styles, some metagram circuitry, which themselves are more prone to artful utilization. Or when I say artful, I guess I mean complex or sophisticated, you know. Anyway, I don't want to go down some rabbit hole of speculating about things that I don't have enough basic knowledge about to make insightful claims, but in terms of speculating as to positive correlates between junk DNA or genetics and genetic information, which perhaps is viable information. People know that junk DNA is not actually junk, but that it's a kind of genetic memory, and essentially that's what this might correspond with. But anyway, let me just move on to say that that what then I think the water is. So if metagram circuitry or metagram type is essentially a layer of description or a layer of a technical observance of what the blood of an individual is the embodiment of that incarnation, the embodiment of that spiritual computational processing unit of the agent of the individual. So if the blood, if essentially that is what metagram, my metagram typology involves, is essentially at least a way of delineating what the blood is the form that the blood is taking within a particular individual embodiment. What the water is the water is much more fluid in some sense, and the general condition of the soul. I think that the water. Okay, let me not explain it before. Let me just give the crude rendition. The crude rendition is that the water is the metatype, and that is much more fluid and much more universal and much more universally transmissible and accessible. Maybe I shouldn't try to dignify this idea too much. Maybe I should think about it some more. But because in some sense, you can't even, I mean, everything, to understand anything in any kind of way in which you are using language to arrive at it, because you can feel things through your blood. You can essentially have a kind of direct subjective observation of these things. But the blood is going to equally, within the scope of the blood, you're going to see karma as much as you're going to perhaps see the spirit moving, but you're going to see the spirit moving through the medium of the flesh because blood essentially is only that which can fuel the blood is the fuel of the flesh. It is the activator. It is the fuel of the embodiment. It is the thing that sacrifices itself in order to propel. And the thing that the blood is acting within in a kind of is essentially megagram, and it can only act upon other megagram entities because it is itself, in its own skeletal sense, it is structured out of megagram anatomy, or which are the emotional tones, which is to say that we all have this beastly characteristic. We all have this beastly element of how we are moving within the grooves of the four field circuits. And so we all have a beastly anatomy, therefore, of these emotional tones. And we are all saddled with the utilization of these emotional tones. Our hands and our fingers are all in the karmic mix of the karmic sandwich. The question is that can you hold the sandwich, and can you eat the sandwich and without getting it on your soul? Can you do it in a transcendent way? Can you transcendently hold the blood? Can you transcendently wield the blood in the beastly field circuits? Can you perform that dance, as it were? Can you transmit your spiritual message through the medium of karma? Can you send that signal, which is essentially by its karmic reading mysterious in some way? Can you transcend or graduate from the ambiguity of that mystery, as it were? And it's said in scripture, flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom. So are you capable of sort of sacrificing your blood in the right wavelength of intelligible signal sending? Where is your mind occupied? Is it invested in the blood, or is it controlling over the blood, as it were? Okay, anyway, but I'm getting beyond my point. My point here is to contrast this with the water. Whereas I do think that water will inherit the kingdom in some sense. But there's also a way in which the water is not a record of the truth, but it is a witness of the truth. And so it is also somewhat subjective. But it is almost by its nature, it has to, I think, properly be conceived of as somewhat disembodied, even though it is subjectively witnessed. But the distinction that I'm trying to make between the water and the blood is that, and using the medium of going with the view that the water is metatype and that the blood is metagram, is that you do have a developmental arc of maturity from which to walk. You do have a path that has to be taken, and that path is going to be contained through the lens of your water, that is the lens of navigating the world. Which is also going to have a subjective or particularization according to your subjective view of things, because we, in some sense, we don't seem to have all the same, exactly the same overlay of water, but in that we have, I don't want to say that we have different waters. We all have an unconscious and a subconscious and an ego and a superego. So in that way, the water is all the same for everyone, but it is somewhat occupying different territory within the 17 model. And so, this is a little bit tricky for me to work out how to extol this, that the water is metatype, and metatype means that there are 17, is also essentially the same thing as the 17 model of cognitive function. So if the water is the 17 model and it is the overlay of metatype onto that 17 model, the soul is entracted within a particular developmental arc, within a particular developmental story. And that story has the same mystery as everybody else, has the same issue of the water, but it is the same and it is different. It is the same because we all have a superego and we all have an ego, and we all have a subconscious and an unconscious according to the metatype overlay, and it's all happening over the 17 dimensions, but those 17 dimensions are corresponding differently in terms of the footprint, or that there are 17 metatypes. So if there are 17 metatypes, but they all are linked onto the same overlay structure, there are 17 different particular vantage points, but that difference perhaps is not such a qualitatively different sort of thing. In fact, the blood might be the thing that is actually creating the real problematic elements of difference. So that, let's say the unity or the holism of the witness of the water is something that can be reconciled and something that can lead to a unified vision of these things. But it is the particular mechanics of the blood which make it particularly hard or egregiously problematic. And it is, let's say, the complexities of the blood, and also the fact that there is not necessarily going to be a unifying thing, a unifying narrative or a unifying understanding that validates all blood mechanics or all blood. In some sense, it is also, I think, on some level, the blood that has to come into a full willing sacrifice and subjugation of itself to its own sort of refinement, or anyway. But I do think that in some sense also even that developmental thing is better understood by the water and not in terms of the blood itself, because in terms of the blood itself it just looks like a zero-sum game, but in terms of the water it's to achieve a developmental integration. Anyway, I don't know how useful this kind of pontification is on these complicated matters, but let me go back to what I was saying about gender. So the stimulus so these cornered stimuluses, I think, might I just want to bring up another issue that I've spoken of in recordings past, and I mean, I even said that, I've often blamed identity politics on, sort of borderline mechanics. And, obviously the interesting thing about a lot of my psychological modeling is obviously how similar and different circuits are. And for example, that and I don't know if I've properly even located a candidate. I mean, I often get the very clear sense when I'm dealing with someone who has a psychopathology, I do sometimes think that I can get a much clearer view as to what metatype they might be. But I haven't thought about metagram deeply in a very long time, because it was such a painful project of empirically mapping out the contents of metagram. It was, it's something that I literally went insane in order to get a full view of, and to craft and to bring it all together in a review of my whole memory bank, at a time in which, sort of, you have to, anyway, I'm not going to repeat my particular methodology of my project, which essentially was constructed with the plan to use a major manic episode in order to, there's essentially exactly what I did is what can be seen in the television program Homeland, where the main character, who has bipolar type 1, goes through a major manic episode, and during which she is able to collate all of the evidence and all of the data of a particular case that has been haunting her and that she's been working on for years and years and years, and experiencing all of these things during a major or thinking about them over a major manic episode gives her, because essentially what is happening when you have a major manic episode is your IQ is going off the charts, because your subconscious framework is unmoored, and you're constructing a new one, and so you're basically reliving the early phase of prelingual infancy, but you're doing so with a bank of data which has been untethered and atomized from its noose, from its network. And so you have a huge array of variability from which to correlate connections from. With a new, if you are in the going through a major manic episode, essentially what you have done is you have some degree you have, and this might contradict some of the things that I've suggested somewhat, but that you are repudiating your sacred contract because you've actually discovered that the superego is not going to be properly served by the sacred contract, and it's self-defeating, and therefore you need a new premise of the positive development of the false ego complex. And so you have atomized your subconscious network, and you are looking for a new aggregating egoic purpose, to try to craft a new project around. And so, basically you are rebelling against your blood in the sense of that you are anyway. But what was I saying? The point that I was first trying to get into describing is that it could be that borderlines have a completely different kind of false ego complex to a bipolar type 1, but they might maybe it might be that bipolar type 1 manifests as two it might be that what is producing bipolar type 1 is 2/3 of the elemental signature cloned stimulus types. So 2/3 of the elementally cloned stimulus, that within their stimulus they have an elemental signature that's cloned in terms of the two emotional tones that are used in the stimulus, that 2/3 of them are present as bipolar type 1, and 1/3 of them present as borderline, or vice versa. And that might be essentially that the that those 2/3 might correspond with just very particular types because of the confluence of metatype and metagram simultaneously. Or it might be guna. It might be that the borderlines are rajasic, and the borderlines are rajasic, and the bipolars are tamasic and sattvaic. It might be something like that, but or it might be just based on a kind of peculiar confluence of metatype and metagram, because each metagram type does have a fixed correlation to a particular metatype. Okay, or at least in defining metagram type as 48, that there are 48 metagram types. There are perhaps other subcategories of metagram types that might be more, that actually, because in some sense, I still haven't properly demarcated. In some sense, metagram includes metatype, but metatype does not include metagram. So anyway, and that's because some of the theoretical structures are not they're technical things that are just that obviously I still need to plumb the depths of. But anyway, so yeah. Anyway, so I'm getting to the point where I've speculated that I keep on blaming the toxicity within culture on borderlines, and I do think that the thing that we are suffering from can archetypally be seen to be a kind of borderline idolatry, or a borderline ideological program or cult that is a kind of collective borderline. And then I think I made some interesting things where I said, oh well, what society is really going through perhaps could be seen to be that we are going through the longest arcs within society, the longest, let's say, cycles of psychological development. If you want to sort of anthropomorphize society as a collection of a single model of an individual, you can almost say that the soul of society is going through these cycles of bipolar cycles. But that might simply mean that might also be, and let me just caveat that maybe my assertion is incorrect, because I've made a special case that my metagram circuit itself and my metatype itself is a very prominent special metatype. I've called it essentially the house of the gift of the apostle. I have linked it to Moses, and I've linked it to and I've linked it to Adam as well, and I've even said that I think that the reason why the gift of the apostle is indispensable is because it is the gift that walks on water, that walked on water to the extent that it was even able to conduct the fall into the development of metagram, into the incarnation of the beastly field circuits and the grooves of karma, that we entered into karma through, you could call it the misuse of a gift, because it wasn't proper, but it was, in the same way that Thomas Aquinas essentially philosophized that, it is a happy fall, but because it was somewhat a necessary fall from grace, because it was better that we should understand than be perfect. Because then we would actually know our freedom, and therefore no reason and reason our knowing of the truth, so that we could actually consciously serve God rather than innocently serving or naively serving. And so essentially it was the necessary colonization of naivety. That is why it is a happy fall, because it is a move towards the necessary colonization of the blood, to put it in practical terms. And it was the gift of the apostle that propitiated us in the mind of Adam, in the spirit of Adam, rather, in the spiritual activity of Adam. That we were spiritually, I can't say spiritually fathered, that's slightly imprecise, because God is the Father, but in that the project that Adam set for us, and that the tempo that he inducted us into in his happy fall, in as much as that the blood itself can be a father, that we are in the fashion of this bloodline. We are we must hope to be like more iterations of Seth, that we are that we need to be a Seth child that actually vindicates the image that Seth is born in, as Seth is born in the image of Adam, that sorry, this is getting a bit figurative, but sort of. So I'm sort of in interweaving the perspective of the blood and the perspective of the water, or interlacing them rather, just to make a cogent point. But I'm very aware of the imprecisions that I'm perhaps drawing on here. But anyway, it's always problematic to try to communicate weird little esoteric nuggets. Anyway, so to say that the long arc of society is being modeled within the vacillation, within the proper balance that needs to happen within the gift of the apostle, and in seeing that society is itself a microcosm of, or is a macrocosm model of the microcosm of the psyche. That sort of culture is made up of the anatomy of what is first found within the personality. Me saying that society is all happening within some theme of, grappling with the gift of the apostle is a natural consequence of that general intellectual framing, which I'm prone to doing. But again, I must also caveat these things that I might only be doing this as a kind of unconscious because the biggest problem is that you can't see the world from other metatypes. You can only see the world from your own metatype. And it might just be that my metatype is so fundamentally has a proclivity towards the quixotic, but also in that I could really leverage the worst kind of skepticism against my own views. I really am capable of surmounting the perfect skeptical, rational reductionary arguments against my own views. I can. So I could say that essentially that I'm obviously obsessed with justice, with the concept of justice, and the need to have a universal justice, and therefore I quickly rush to creating a contemplative narrative in which justice is both plausible and possible. And so, I'm just merely avoiding the hard skepticism of the world. But that is such a cynical and nihilistic contemplative schema. It's a sort of, but just in the realm of technical interpretation, I can easily say that. And these are things, we have to be aware of the darkness. We have to or at least I believe that it's necessary to do so, because otherwise you don't own your own standing. Discern the spirits. And discern the differing spirits. Whether they are of God. Anyway. Okay, so I think I've covered these issues. Was I going to say anything more about... But again, I think, all the gifts are accessible to everyone via the water, because the water, I think, is somewhat universally... I still don't know how to describe that. There are perhaps 17 vantage points within the water, which are different but the same. I think I dealt with that complexity when I talked about how the blood is more so the source of the problem. Anyway, okay, I think I've gone through everything that I wanted to go through.